There are promises you keep because you love someone, and there are promises you keep because you are afraid of what breaking them might cost you. For 22 years, I kept the same promise. Don't go to Silverbrook, Serena. Whatever you do, don't ever go there. Those words came from my husband Daniel on a cold Tuesday night in February, the year we got married, spoken so quietly and with such unusual gravity that I never forgot them. Daniel was not a dramatic man. He was steady and measured in almost everything he did. He was the kind of man who never raised his voice, never left a dish in the sink, and never once in our entire marriage went to bed angry at me. So when he said those words with that particular look in his eyes, something between old grief and quiet desperation, I listened, I promised, and I kept that promise for 2 decades, even when curiosity sat like a splinter under my skin. But now Daniel was gone. He collapsed in our kitchen on an ordinary Wednesday morning in March, still in his work shirt, coffee mug half raised to his lips, and by the time the ambulance arrived, the doctors at Harlow Regional told me there was nothing they could do. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, they called it. A thickening of the heart wall that can go entirely undetected until it simply doesn't. I was 51 years old and widowed in the span of 40 minutes. Our daughter Zara, 26, flew in from Wellington that same afternoon. We held each other in the hospital corridor, and neither of us said a word for a long time. There are moments in life that don't need words. That was one of them. The weeks after Daniel's funeral passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, condolence cards I couldn't bring myself to open, and a grief so heavy it felt almost physical, like wearing a coat made of stone. I went through the motions. I taught my Year 11 English classes on autopilot. I answered emails. I made Zara eat something every time she visited. I was functioning, but I wasn't really there. And then I got the call from Mr. Ashford. Reginald Ashford had been Daniel's personal attorney for over 15 years, a quiet, careful man with wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake like a formal apology. His office was on the 4th floor of a glass building in Christchurch, and he asked me to come in at my earliest convenience to discuss the remainder of Daniel's estate. I assumed it would be paperwork. I assumed it would be tedious and painful in the quiet way that all legal formalities following a death tend to be. I had no idea it was about to change everything I thought I knew about my husband. I sat across from Mr. Ashford on a grey Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral, and listened as he walked me through Daniel's financial arrangements with practiced efficiency. The family home, the superannuation funds, the life insurance policy. Standard enough. And then he paused, cleared his throat in that particular way lawyers do when they're about to say something they know will unsettle you, and slid a small wooden box across his desk toward me. Inside the box was a key, old-fashioned iron, heavier than I expected, with a small silver pendant attached to a chain. The pendant was shaped like a fern leaf, the kind you find on the South Island hillsides in autumn. "What is this?" I asked. He explained it to me in measured, careful sentences. 3 years ago, Daniel had purchased a property in the Otago region of the South Island, a large station property called Silverbrook. According to his instructions, I was only to be told of its existence after his death. The deed had been transferred into my name. All rates and maintenance costs were prepaid for the next 6 years. I sat very still for a moment. "Silverbrook," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "Yes," Mr. Ashford confirmed. "I understand that name means something to you." It was the place he made me promise never to go. "There is another matter," Mr. Ashford said. "The property has attracted significant interest recently. Geological surveys conducted on neighboring land 18 months ago indicated the presence of a substantial lithium deposit in the wider region. Your husband was approached by several energy and mining corporations. He declined all of them." "Lithium," I repeated. "For electric vehicle batteries primarily. The deposit under and around the Silverbrook land may be one of the largest undeveloped lithium formations in the southern hemisphere. Several companies have already made preliminary inquiries about acquiring the property, since your husband's passing became public knowledge." My head was spinning. Daniel had never once, in 22 years, mentioned owning property. We lived comfortably on his salary as a structural engineer, and my income as a secondary school English teacher. We had a good life, a real life, but we were not wealthy people by any stretch. How did he afford it? I asked. He sold a significant portion of his investment portfolio, Mr. Ashford said, accumulated quietly over many years. He also took a personal loan, which he repaid in full within the first 18 months of ownership. I pressed my fingers against the key in my palm, feeling the cold weight of it. There is one more thing, Mr. Ashford said. He placed an envelope on the desk between us. Daniel left this for you. His instructions were that you read it here, in this office, before making any decisions. My name was written across the front in Daniel's handwriting, that neat, compact script I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the margins of crossword puzzles for 22 years. My throat tightened. I opened it carefully. My darling Serena, if you are reading this letter, then I'm already gone, and I have a great deal of explaining to do. I'm sorry for the weight of the secrets I've carried. I carried them because I loved you, not in spite of that love. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with the same heart condition that killed my father. The doctors told me I had between 2 and 5 years. I chose not to tell you or Zara. I know you'll be angry about that choice. You have every right to be. But I wanted the years we had left to be full of living, not full of watching me diminish. I spent those years building something for you. Silverbrook was my childhood home, the place I fled when I was 17 and swore I would never return to. What happened there was not something I could speak about easily. But 3 years ago, when I knew my time was limited, I understood that the only way to heal the past was to return to it and transform it. I bought Silverbrook back from the estate of my father. I spent every business trip, every extended weekend I could arrange, rebuilding it into something worthy of you. Go there, Serena. I'm releasing you from the promise you kept so faithfully. In the main house, on the writing desk in the study, you'll find a laptop. The password is the name of the street we lived on when we first met, followed by the year Zara was born. I love you more than these words can carry, Daniel. I sat in that office for a very long time after I finished reading. And then I said, I'm going to Silverbrook, Mr. Ashford. Today, if I can manage it. He nodded, as though he had been expecting exactly that. There is one more thing you should be aware of, he said carefully. Daniel's brothers have already been in contact with this office, all 3 of them. They are contesting the will, claiming that Daniel was not of sound mind when he purchased and renovated the Silverbrook property, and that as the surviving male relatives, they have a rightful claim to what they consider a family estate. I looked at him with a steadiness I did not entirely feel. Daniel has 3 brothers? Had, Mr. Ashford corrected gently. One passed away some years ago. There are 2 surviving brothers, Vincent, the eldest, and Ronan. A half-brother named Seth has also been in contact, though his position appears to be less adversarial at this stage. Daniel never spoke of them, I said quietly. I don't believe that was an accident. I tucked the letter into my bag, closed my fingers around the iron key, and stood up from the chair. Thank you, I said. I'll be in touch. 36 hours later, after a flight to Queenstown, a hire car, and a 2-hour drive into the Otago backcountry, along roads that narrowed from sealed to gravel to barely there, I found myself parked in front of a pair of old wooden gates with the name Silverbrook Station carved into a weathered sign overhead. Beyond the gates, a long driveway curved through stands of Silver Beach and Mountain Beach, their canopies catching the last of the afternoon light. In the distance, set against a backdrop of tawny hills, I could see the outline of a large homestead, a veranda wrapping all the way around, chimneys rising from a dark slate roof, and flanking outbuildings that looked freshly maintained. This was no neglected ruin. This was a home. I got out of the car and stood for a moment in the quiet. The only sounds were wind through beech leaves and the faint rush of a creek somewhere nearby. The air smelled of damp earth and mountain grass and something sweeter that I couldn't quite name. The key fit the gate lock perfectly. As I drove up the long driveway, my pulse was doing something complicated in my chest. Not quite grief, not quite wonder, but something woven from both. Daniel had been here. He had walked this ground repeatedly over 3 years, quietly rebuilding something broken, and I had known nothing about it. The husband I thought I knew completely had kept an entire world from me, and I was only now stepping into it. The homestead was extraordinary. 2 stories of local schist stone, with wide veranda boards, stained the color of dark honey. Window boxes filled with late-season flowers. A garden that had clearly been tended with great care. Not formal, but wild in an intentional way. The way gardens look when someone has thought hard about what should grow where, and let the land do the rest. I sat in my hire car for a full minute before I trusted my legs to carry me. If you have ever lost someone, and then walked into a space that holds the shape of their love for you, you will understand what happened to me when I opened the front door of Silverbrook Station and stepped inside. You will understand the kind of silence that falls over you when you realize that every object in a room was chosen with you in mind. The entryway opened into a large central room with exposed stone walls, a fireplace tall enough to stand in, and wide remove floorboards that gleamed with fresh oil. But it wasn't the architecture that dropped me to my knees. Not literally, but close enough that I had to grip the doorframe and breathe carefully for a moment. Every surface, every wall, every shelf was filled with books. Not just any books, my books. The kind I had loved all my life and talked about over dinner and recommended to my students and described in the margins of my journal. First editions I had mentioned only in passing, years ago, not even certain Daniel had been listening. Collected works by writers I had adored since university. Rare prints of my favorite poetry collections behind glass frames. And tucked between the shelves, slim volumes of poetry, handwritten cards from Daniel explaining why he had chosen each one, what had made him think of me when he found it. I stood in that room and cried in a way I had not let myself cry since the hospital corridor. It took me a long time to find the study. The laptop was exactly where he said it would be, silver, slim, with a small potted fern on the desk beside it, and a single dried flower pressed flat under a piece of clear glass. A yellow coreopsis, the same flower I had been holding the day we met at a university garden party 24 years earlier. I had not thought Daniel even noticed the flower. I had been carrying it simply because I liked the color. He had noticed everything. If you feel my words, if this story is reaching something real inside you, then do me a small favor and show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, because I want to see how far a woman's voice can carry when she tells the truth. Help me build this community so we can keep bringing stories like this one to you. Now let me keep going, because what came next changed everything. I typed in the password. The laptop woke, and a folder appeared on the desktop, simply labeled, "For Serena." Inside were 365 video files, each named with a date beginning the day after Daniel's funeral. I sat very still. Then I clicked the first one. Daniel appeared on screen, healthy, clear-eyed, not the pale, quieter version of him I had watched fade in the final months and attributed to work stress. This was Daniel, the way I remembered him at his best, sitting in this very room, his dark green jumper, his familiar half-smile that always arrived a moment before the rest of his expression had decided what he was doing. "Hello, love," he said. "If you're watching this, then you've come to Silverbrook, and you've found the study, and you've probably already cried at least once in the book room, am I right?" I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He leaned forward slightly. "I've made a video for every day of your first year without me, 365 of them. Some days I'll explain the past. Some days I'll tell you things I should have said out loud while I had the chance. Some days I'll just talk to you the way we used to talk on long drives when we forgot to listen to the radio." He paused. "Today I want to explain about Silverbrook. Not all of it, not in one sitting, but the beginning at least." He took a breath. "When I was a child, this place was not what you see now. My father ran Silverbrook the way he ran everything in his life, badly, selfishly, and with a particular talent for making the people around him feel small. My brothers Vincent and Ronan had their mother, a formidable woman who protected them from the worst of him. I had no one like that. My mother left when I was 3, not because she didn't love me, I've come to understand that much, but because she couldn't survive him. She took what she could carry and disappeared completely. My father told Vincent and Ronan she had died. He told me the same thing for years before I discovered the truth. My hands were not steady. Outside, the sound of gravel under tires broke the silence of the property. I moved to the window and felt my stomach drop. A large black four-wheel drive had turned in from the gate and was moving up the driveway with the unhurried confidence of people who believe they are arriving somewhere that belongs to them. Behind it came a second vehicle, a white SUV with rental plates. As I watched, both vehicles parked beside my hire car, and 4 people got out. 3 men, all tall, all carrying versions of Daniel's jaw and the same dark brows, and a woman I didn't recognize, who was dressed in a suit and carrying a briefcase. Vincent and Ronan Voss had arrived, and they had brought a lawyer. And walking slightly behind them, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched with an uncertainty the others didn't share, was a younger man I could only assume was Seth. I moved away from the window, picked up my phone, and called Mr. Ashford. "They're here," I said. "All of them." He didn't sound surprised. "Don't let them in without witnesses," he advised. "And don't sign anything. I'll have someone to you within the hour." I hung up and stood in Daniel's study, surrounded by his books, holding his iron key, and listened to the knock at the front door. The knock came again, heavier this time. Then a voice, low and carrying, with an accent that was part New Zealand, part something else, flattened by years of living elsewhere. "Serena, I'm Vincent Voss, Daniel's oldest brother. I think it's time we talked." I thought about Daniel's face on that screen, his careful voice, his chosen words. He'd anticipated this too. I was certain of it. I tucked the laptop under my arm, crossed to the front door, and opened it. Vincent Voss was in his early 60s, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and wearing the expression of a man who was accustomed to being accommodated. Behind him stood Ronan, a decade younger, darker, watching me with the focused attention of someone calculating variables. Seth stood furthest back, and when our eyes met briefly, his dropped first. The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. "My name is Patricia Dunn. I represent the interests of the Voss family estate." I stood in the doorway without moving aside. "Mrs. Voss," she continued, "my clients have significant concern about the validity of recent transfers of the Silverbrook Station property, particularly given the circumstances surrounding Mr. Voss's final years." "My husband was of perfectly sound mind," I said. "Perhaps," she said smoothly. "That's precisely what the courts will determine." Vincent's expression shifted, the business face dropping briefly into something more human. "Serena, we didn't come here to be hostile. We came because this property has been in our family for 3 generations. Whatever Daniel told you about his reasons for buying it back, there are things you don't know. Things about how he came to acquire it from our father, and whether that transaction was properly conducted." I looked at this man who shared Daniel's forehead and Daniel's hands and none of Daniel's quietness. I looked at Ronan, who was scanning the visible interior of the house with barely concealed assessment. I looked at Seth, who looked like he wished he was somewhere else entirely. "You're welcome to wait on the veranda," I said. "My attorney will be here shortly, and we can have a proper conversation then. But I won't be inviting you inside without legal representation present." Vincent's jaw tightened. "This is a family property, Serena." "This is my property," I said, "and I'd appreciate you respecting that distinction until we have the appropriate people in the room." I closed the door. My hands were shaking slightly as I went back to the study. I opened the laptop, found the second video, and pressed play with the sound very low, one ear on the veranda where I could hear them talking. Daniel appeared again. "Kat, if my brothers have found you before you've had much time at the house, I anticipated this. I prepared for it. The blue folder in the bottom left drawer of this desk contains everything you need. The original deed of sale from my father, witnessed and properly notarized. The legal transfer documents drawn up by Mr. Ashford's office and filed with Land Information New Zealand 3 years ago. Bank records of the transaction and sworn statements from 3 independent witnesses to my father's mental competency and voluntary agreement on the day of the sale. They will tell you the transaction was invalid. They will tell you our father was not competent. What they won't tell you is that I saw this coming, and I prepared for every argument they could make, because I know them. I grew up with them, and I know exactly what they look like when they want something badly enough to be dishonest about it. I was already opening the bottom left drawer. The blue folder was exactly where he said it would be, thick, organized, with tabbed sections and a covering note in Daniel's handwriting, listing every document inside and its purpose. He had been 3 steps ahead all along. The next 40 minutes passed in a careful stillness. I reviewed the folder's contents while the sounds from the veranda reached me in murmurs. At some point, the woman with the briefcase made a phone call. At some point, Ronan walked the perimeter of the front garden. At some point, Seth sat down on the veranda steps and stared at the distant hills in a way that looked more like grief than strategy. Mr. Ashford's associate, a young woman named Haley Fraser, arrived in 45 minutes and not 60, and I met her at the door with considerable relief. The meeting that followed happened in the homestead's large dining room, around a table that Daniel had clearly chosen with care. Solid matai timber, 8 chairs, a fireplace at one end. I sat at the head of it. Haley sat to my right, with her own files open. Vincent and Ronan sat opposite, with Patricia Dunn beside them. Seth took the chair furthest from everyone, which told me something. Vincent opened the conversation with the practiced reasonableness of a man who had conducted difficult negotiations before. "We're not here to be adversarial," he said again. "We simply want what's fair." Haley, to her credit, let him finish before speaking. "Mr. Voss, the deed of transfer for Silverbrook Station was executed legally and without duress on the 14th of March, 3 years ago. The vendor at that time was your father, Gordon Voss, and all relevant Land Information New Zealand requirements were met. Your brother retained independent legal counsel for the transaction. Your father did the same. That transaction was conducted while our father was in cognitive decline," Patricia Dunn said. Haley opened her folder. "I have 3 sworn statements here from witnesses, including your father's own general practitioner, who conducted a mental competency assessment on the same day as the sale, and found him fully capable of understanding and consenting to the transaction. I'm happy to provide copies for your review." Patricia Dunn's composure tightened very slightly. She had been expecting resistance, but perhaps not this level of preparation. Vincent looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Serena, regardless of the legality of the original sale, the fact remains that this property has belonged to the Voss family since our grandfather built the first homestead here in 1947. Daniel knew what it meant to us. Your brother also knew what it meant to him," I said, "and he made a legal purchase, invested considerable personal resources into restoring it, and left it to his wife." Ronan leaned forward for the first time, and when he spoke, his voice was lower and harder than Vincent's. "You've been here less than 3 hours. You know nothing about this land, this family, or what Daniel was actually like before he became whoever he presented to you." I met his gaze and kept my voice level. "I was married to your brother for 22 years. I knew him when he was tired, and when he was joyful, and when he was frightened, and when he was the most purely himself that a person can be." "You didn't know him at all?" Ronan's jaw worked, but he didn't answer. Seth's voice came from the end of the table, quiet but clear. "She's right." Everyone looked at him. He was looking at the table, his hands folded in front of him. "You didn't know him," he said to his brothers. "Neither did I, not really. But I at least admit that." Vincent's expression sharpened. "Seth." "No," Seth said, still quietly. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is about family sentiment. You both know it's about the lithium surveys. You weren't interested in Silverbrook for 20 years, and then suddenly 18 months ago, it became important to you. Don't pretend otherwise to this woman." The room was very still. Haley, to her professional credit, kept her face entirely neutral. I made a note on the legal pad in front of me. "I think," I said, "that we've covered enough ground for one afternoon. You've been provided with the relevant documentation. I'll give you time to review it. If you have further legal arguments to make, you're welcome to address them to Miss Fraser's office in writing. But Silverbrook Station is my property, and I'll be staying here, so I'd appreciate you arranging accommodation elsewhere." They left without achieving anything, which I suspected was not what they had planned when they drove through those gates. Patricia Dunn looked professionally disappointed. Ronan looked like a man quietly recalibrating. Vincent looked like a man who had underestimated someone and was annoyed at himself for it. Seth was the last to leave. He paused at the front door and turned back to look at me. I want you to know, he said, that I didn't come here for the same reasons they did. Daniel was kind to me once, when no one else was. I just wanted to see the place he spent his last years making something out of. I studied him for a moment. The same hazel, the same slight downward cast of the outer corners that made Daniel look thoughtful even when he was simply tired. You can come back, I said, when they're not here. He nodded once and left. I closed the door and leaned my back against it and let myself breathe for the first time since the black four-wheel drive had appeared on the driveway. Haley reappeared from the dining room with her files. You handled that extremely well, she said. I was bluffing about half of it, I admitted. She smiled. You'd be surprised how often that's true in these situations. After she left, I went back to the study and sat in the chair behind Daniel's desk. Outside the windows, the last of the day's light was going golden and long across the hills. Somewhere in one of the paddocks, I could hear an animal moving, something large and unhurried. I opened the laptop and looked at the folder of 365 videos. I pressed play on number 3. Daniel's face filled the screen, and for a moment, just a moment, I forgot entirely that he was gone. He was so present, so specific in the way he sat, the way he tilted his head slightly before he began speaking, the way his hands rested on the desk, exactly the way they had rested on 1,000 dinner tables and office desks and steering wheels over our life together. The horse in the south paddock, he said, is named Comet. He's a dark bay Connemara, 17 years old, very food-motivated, and slightly suspicious of red umbrellas. Ellis bought him from a station up in the Mackenzie Basin. He remembered you mentioning once, years ago, that your grandmother used to keep Connemaras on her property when you were a girl, and that they were the first horses you ever fell in love with. I couldn't remember which breed you'd said at first, so I called your Aunt Patricia in Cork to ask her. She confirmed it. He paused. I realize now I should have just asked you directly, but I think a part of me always wanted this place to be a surprise. A large, expensive, multi-year surprise, but a surprise. I was laughing through tears for the second time that evening. The man he mentioned, I realized, must be the caretaker. I hadn't met him yet. I hadn't explored much beyond the main house, truth be told. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I would explore everything. Tonight I would sit in Daniel's study in Daniel's house and watch him be alive for as long as the battery on the laptop held. Outside, the hills went from gold to grey, to the quiet dark of a New Zealand evening. And somewhere in the south paddock, Comet moved through the grass, and above the homestead, the stars came out one by one, sharp and extravagant, the way they are in the high country, when there is no other light for miles. I fell asleep in the study chair with the laptop still open, and Daniel's voice in my ears, and I did not dream of grief. I dreamed of something that felt almost like beginning. Morning arrived at Silverbrook, with a particular quality of light that belongs to high country valleys, clear and cold and tilted, coming over the eastern ridge in long horizontal lines that turned the frosted grass into something that looked briefly like silver. I woke stiff in the study chair, a blanket I didn't remember fetching folded over my legs. I was fairly sure I hadn't put it there myself. I wasn't wrong. There was a note on the desk in handwriting I didn't recognize. Good morning, Mrs. Voss. I'm Kieran. I manage the property. I arrived early for the morning rounds and saw lights on in the study. Didn't want to wake you. Coffee's on in the kitchen. Comet has been fed and is waiting to meet you at your convenience. He said you'd know which paddock. I folded the note and smiled at it in a way that probably looked slightly undignified. Kieran turned out to be a man in his mid-50s, with a face that looked like it had spent most of those years outdoors, strongly featured, weathered in a way that suggested competence rather than hardship. He shook my hand over the kitchen bench with the directness of someone who takes people as they come, and he had the coffee exactly right without asking, which told me Daniel had briefed him carefully. He was here every month, Kieran told me, stirring his own coffee, sometimes more often toward the end, when the art studio was being fitted out. Art studio, I repeated. He looked at me carefully. You haven't found it yet? No, he nodded slowly. There's quite a bit you haven't found yet, Mrs. Voss. Your husband was a thorough man. He liked to be prepared. He led me through the homestead's west wing to a door I had assumed was a laundry or a utility room. The key to it was in the same kitchen drawer where Kieran told me Daniel always kept keys he considered important. I unlocked it and pushed it open. The room was large and north-facing, the entire far wall a series of tall windows looking out over the hills. At the center stood a piano. Not just any piano, a Steinway Model B, dark walnut cabinet, keys yellowed just enough to be warm rather than white. Beside it, a proper music stand, shelves of sheet music organized by composer, a recording set up in the corner, modest but professional grade, the kind a serious musician would use at home. And, on the walls, framed photographs, concert programs, handwritten notes, a complete archive of a life in music that I had largely set aside at 28 years old, when Zara arrived, and time and money and energy redistributed themselves in the way they do. I hadn't played seriously in over 2 decades. I hadn't played at all in 6 years. I walked to the piano and sat down at the bench without entirely deciding to. I'd placed my hands on the keys and felt the particular settling that happens in your body when you return to something that was always yours, even during the years you were absent from it. I pressed middle C. The sound filled the room, round and resonant, and completely real. Behind me, I could hear Kieran step quietly back and pull the door closed, giving me privacy. I sat at that piano for an hour and a half, and played everything I could remember, and worked through the parts I'd forgotten, and found that the music had not gone anywhere. It had just been waiting, the way a river waits under ice. I played until my fingers ached in the unfamiliar way of disused muscles being asked to work again. And then I stopped, and sat with my hands in my lap, and thought about Daniel tracking down a Steinway for me. Daniel contacting Aunt Patricia in Cork about horses. Daniel spending 3 years creating the exact conditions in which I might be able to become, again, the version of myself I had set aside in the business of a life well lived. He had always paid attention. I had known that. The message Kieran left had mentioned other things I hadn't found yet. I spent the rest of that morning exploring. The homestead had 6 bedrooms, a proper library with a reading alcove and a fireplace, a kitchen designed for someone who loved cooking, which I did, and which Daniel had known, a large sitting room with a record player and an LP collection that made me laugh out loud when I found it, because it was organized alphabetically by musician, and I had spent years trying unsuccessfully to get Daniel to organize anything alphabetically. In the South Paddock, just as promised, I found Comet. He was exactly 17 years old, and slightly suspicious of the red travel jacket I was wearing, which made me laugh again. He was dark bay, short-backed with the kind of intelligent eye that Connemara's always seemed to carry, and he let me approach after about 4 minutes of careful assessment, and then pressed his forehead against my shoulder with the familiarity of an animal that has been told to expect you. I stood there with a horse's weight against me and the mountain air in my lungs, and cried again, not from sadness this time, but from the accumulated weight of being loved so carefully by someone who was no longer there to receive the same care back. There were 2 other horses in the adjacent paddock, a grey thoroughbred mare named Dust, and a stocky New Zealand thoroughbred cross named Rafter, all 3 of them cared for with obvious attention by Kieran and his assistant, a quiet young woman named Peter, who had grown up on a station in the Waikato and moved south for the work. I was beginning to understand that Silverbrook was not a weekend property, or an investment, or an inheritance in the ordinary sense. It was a life, a whole, considered, constructed life, waiting for me to step into it, which made what happened next considerably more complicated. Zara called me on the 3rd morning at Silverbrook, voice tense in a way I recognized as her trying to manage something before telling me about it. "Mom," she paused, "one of Dad's brothers has been in touch with me." I was standing in the kitchen with my 2nd coffee of the morning. He found my work email somehow and sent me a message. She hesitated. It was actually quite measured. He didn't make any demands. He said he understood that the legal situation was complicated, and that he just wanted to build a connection with the family he'd never had the chance to know. I set down my coffee. Zara continued before I could speak. "I know what you're going to say. But, Mum, he was Dad's brother. He's my uncle. I don't even know if I'm allowed to be curious about him. I understand that, I said carefully. And I want you to know I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I need you to be careful. Your father was very deliberate about keeping distance from his brothers. He had reasons that I'm only beginning to understand. Don't share information about the property with them. Don't agree to any meetings without telling me first. There was a pause. Is there something you haven't told me yet? Quite a lot, I admitted. Come to Silverbrook, Zara. Come this weekend and I'll show you everything. Your father left something for you too. She arrived on a Saturday morning in a hire car, pulling up the long driveway with that particular combination of apprehension and wonder on her face that I recognized from the first video of Daniel's, because it was probably the same expression I'd been wearing all week. She stepped out of the car and stood looking at the homestead for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "He built this for you." "Yes," I said. "He spent 3 years building this for you and he never said a word." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were bright with the particular emotion of discovering something too beautiful and too sad at the same time. Dad was something else, wasn't he? He really was, I said. I showed her everything, the book room, the music studio, the piano. I watched her face move through the same sequence of emotions mine had. Recognition and loss, and overwhelming love for a man who was no longer here to receive it. When we reached the paddock, and she stood face to face with Comet, she didn't speak for a full minute. She just pressed her forehead against his neck, the same way I had, and I understood that Daniel had inherited my grandmother's horses in his planning too. That evening, after dinner, I opened the laptop and found the video he had labeled for Zara. Day 14. When she visits. I gave her space to watch it alone in the music room, and I sat in the kitchen and listened to the hum of the property settling around us in the dark. She came out 20 minutes later with red eyes and a very straight spine. "He told me about the brothers," she said. I nodded. "He told me about what they did to him when he was a teenager. The money they took, the signatures they forged, the reason he left New Zealand and spent almost 2 years in Ireland before moving to the UK, and then eventually to us." She sat down at the kitchen table. "Mum, they're not looking for family connection. They're looking for leverage." "I know. Ronan's message to me," she said. "He mentioned in passing that he'd love to visit the property someday. That it would mean a great deal to him to see where Daniel had spent his last years." She looked at me with her father's precision. "That's reconnaissance, isn't it?" "Yes, I believe it is." "What do we do?" "The same thing your father prepared us to do," I said. "We don't panic, and we don't react, and we wait until we know exactly what they're planning before we move." She looked at me for a moment. "You've changed this week." "I've been in school," I said. She almost smiled. "Dad's school?" "In a sense, yes." The next morning, Kieran appeared at the kitchen door, looking like a man who had decided it was time to share something he had been waiting on. "Mrs. Voss." He knocked on the open door, something he did as a courtesy, even when it wasn't necessary. "There's something your husband asked me to show you, if the situation with his brothers became serious enough. I think it's reached that point." I put down my tea. He led Zara and me out across the yard, past the main stables, and toward a large weathered woolshed at the property's western edge. Unlike everything else at Silverbrook, which showed the careful attention of Daniel's restoration, this building had been left in its original state, planks grey with age, tin roof rust-spotted, sagging slightly at one end. "Your husband left this building deliberately unimproved," Kieran said, producing an old key. "He said anyone looking at this place from outside would assume it was the part of the property not worth paying attention to." He was right. Even I had barely glanced at it. Inside smelled of lanolin and old timber, rusting farm equipment, bins of ancient fencing wire, the particular dark of the building that hasn't seen much purpose in years. Kieran moved confidently to the far corner, where several old feed sacks were stacked against the wall. He shifted them aside to reveal a metal panel set into the wooden floor, heavy gauge, with a combination lock. He input the code without hesitating and pulled the panel up. Beneath it, a concrete staircase descended into lit, clean, temperature-controlled space. "He built a room down here," Zara said. "He said it was insurance," Kieran replied, just like your father described it. We followed him down. The underground room was larger than I expected. Concrete walls, strip lighting, filing cabinets along one side, and a central desk with computer equipment. The walls were covered in maps, printed documents, and photographs connected by lines in the way you see in detective stories. Except this was entirely real. Welcome to what Mr. Voss called the archive, Kieran said quietly. I moved to the wall first. The centerpiece was a detailed survey map of Silverbrook and its surrounds for a significant radius. The Silverbrook land was outlined in blue. Surrounding properties were marked in various colors, with notes beside them. Red circles indicated areas of geological interest, concentrated in two regions. One was in the eastern section of the property, which I already knew about from Mr. Ashford. But the second concentration was larger, far larger, in the western section that ran up into the foothills, and that concentration had a single word written beside it, in Daniel's handwriting. Primary. Zara was beside me, reading over my shoulder. Mum, the western section, look at the acreage comparison. I looked. The eastern section, where everyone's geological interest had been focused, covered roughly 400 acres. The western section, the rough, broken, apparently unusable terrain that Vincent had barely looked at when he'd driven up the driveway, covered nearly 800 acres, and the lithium formation beneath it, according to the survey notations, was not only larger, but significantly more accessible in terms of extraction depth. Dad knew, Zara said softly. He found out about 18 months ago, Kieran confirmed. Hired 3 independent geologists, one at a time, and had each of them survey a different section of the property without telling them about the others. Only when he had all 3 reports did he understand the complete picture. And his brother's proposal for dividing the property, I said slowly, working it through, excluded the western section entirely, Kieran finished. They put all their emphasis on the eastern acreage and the productive paddocks in the existing infrastructure, and presented the western section as essentially worthless terrain. Zara made a sound of quiet fury. There's more, Kieran said. He moved to the filing cabinets. Your husband spent the last 2 years of his life documenting his brother's business activities, not obsessively, but systematically. The middle drawer. Inside the middle drawer were organized files, each tabbed with a name. Vincent Ronan. Documents that Daniel had collected, printed, cross-referenced. Emails obtained through a source he didn't name in the notes, but referenced obliquely as someone in a position to verify. Financial records, witness statements from former employees. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Vincent's investment company had been operating a number of questionable schemes, leveraging client funds in ways that skirted the boundaries of financial regulation, and in at least 2 instances appeared to have crossed them. Ronan, who practiced as a commercial lawyer, had drafted documents on behalf of several of Vincent's clients that contained deliberate ambiguities designed to benefit Vincent's funds at those clients' expense. It was not the conduct of criminals in the dramatic sense. It was the conduct of men who had been cutting corners and exploiting positions of trust for so long that they had ceased to see it as anything other than normal business. Daniel had assembled enough here to make their lives extremely complicated. Why didn't he use this when they came after the property the first time? Zara asked. Kieran looked at her. Because he didn't want to be like them, he said simply. The archive also contained in the right-hand filing cabinet a set of documents relating to a different matter entirely, a matter I had not anticipated, and which, when I read through it, changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about why Daniel had built this particular safety net so carefully. He had found his mother. Not found her alive. She had passed away 12 years earlier, in a small town in the Waikato, alone and not poor but not wealthy either. But he had found her history. Her name, Margaret Cole. Her life after leaving Silverbrook, a story of quiet survival and considerable resilience. And in that history, he had found something else. A daughter. Margaret's daughter, born 8 years after she had left Silverbrook. A half-sister to Daniel, a woman named Vivian Cole, who was 42 years old and living in Hamilton, entirely unaware that she had any connection to the Voss family, or to Silverbrook Station, or to a brother who had died without ever having the courage to introduce himself. There was a sealed envelope in the back of the file. It was addressed simply, to be opened if necessary. I held it for a moment. Then, I set it back in the cabinet. Not yet, I thought. But I understood now why Daniel had gathered it. And I was beginning to understand the architecture of everything he had prepared. It was not just about protecting the property. It was about having answers to questions that hadn't been asked yet. We need to call Mr. Ashford, I told Kieran. And I think we also need to arrange a conversation with a mining company. Not the ones who've been approaching through the brothers, an independent one. There's a company called Southern Reach Resources, Kieran said, based in Dunedin. Mr. Voss was in contact with their CEO in the months before his death. I have the contact details. He left those too? Zara said, a little breathlessly. He thought of everything, Kieran said. Almost. Almost? I looked at him. He didn't predict that his half-brother Seth would turn out to be decent, he said. I think he expected 3 adversaries. He only got 2. I thought of Seth on the veranda steps, staring at the hills. Seth's voice at the end of the dining room table saying, "She's right." Seth's eyes meeting mine briefly, before he dropped them. Not yet, I thought again, but Seth was something to think about. That evening I called Zara's video with her on the couch beside me, so she could hear. This time, it was Daniel in a different setting, outdoors on the eastern veranda, the hills behind him in afternoon light. The brothers will eventually escalate beyond legal arguments, he said. If they do, I want you to make 1 phone call before you make any others. He gave a name and a number, both of which Kieran confirmed were current. The name was Thomas Alloy, CEO of Southern Reach Resources. Daniel had apparently spent 6 months in careful conversation with Thomas, laying out a vision for what responsible extraction at Silverbrook could look like. Not a sale of the mineral rights, not a carve-up of the land, a partnership arrangement with detailed environmental protections, restoration commitments built into the contract, and a structure that kept Serena and Zara in full ownership while providing a royalty income for multiple generations. He'd already done the negotiation, Zara said quietly. He'd spent 6 months laying the groundwork with the best option available, so you wouldn't have to do it under pressure. I couldn't speak for a moment. The reason this matters, Daniel continued on the video, is that the brothers will almost certainly approach you with their own mining contact. Someone who will present numbers that seem generous, but who will be structured to benefit their involvement as middlemen. If you've already spoken with Thomas, you'll know what the real value looks like, and you'll understand why their offer is designed to confuse, rather than inform. He looked directly at the camera. You're smarter than they're counting on you being, love. That's always been the thing they'll never understand about you. You look like the soft option, and you are not the soft option. If you're still with me in this story, still listening and feeling every turn of it, then please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which city or town you're from, because I want to build a community of women and people who believe that a voice telling the truth matters. Help me keep bringing stories like this one to you. We're getting to the part where everything comes together. The following week was the most deliberately active I had been in my entire adult life outside of a classroom. I called Thomas Alloy and had a 2-hour conversation that felt less like a business negotiation and more like 2 people who had both been briefed by the same very thorough third party. He knew Daniel's environmental conditions by heart. He had already had 3 geological assessments done in anticipation of exactly this conversation. He quoted numbers that made me hold the phone away from my face for a second to breathe. I called Haley Fraser every morning and asked for updates on the brothers' legal proceedings. I sat with Zara every evening and watched 2 or 3 of Daniel's videos, building a picture of a man neither of us had fully known while he was alive, not because he was deceptive, but because grief and time and the inevitable narrowing of daily life had left so many conversations unheld. And every morning I sat at the piano for an hour before the rest of the day began. The music was coming back. My hands remembered things my mind had stopped believing it knew. On the 8th day at Silverbrook, the brothers made their move. Patricia Dunn filed a formal legal challenge with the High Court, challenging the validity of the original sale from Gordon Voss to Daniel, citing a recently obtained document that they claimed was a second, later will from Gordon Voss, which explicitly left Silverbrook Station to his eldest 3 sons. It arrived by email to Haley's office at 9 in the morning. By 9:15, she called me. "This document is dated 6 months before Gordon Voss died," she said. "Daniel's purchase was completed 2 years before that date. The document references Silverbrook explicitly, but, and this is important, it was drawn up after the property had already been legally transferred. It has no legal effect on the ownership." "Then why file it?" I asked. "To delay," she said. "To create public uncertainty. And possibly to create enough noise that a less prepared landowner might consider a settlement, simply to make it stop." I thought of the archive beneath the woolshed. "Haley," I said, "I think it's time to have a full conversation about the documentation my husband left. There's more than I showed you in the initial meeting." I heard her sit forward in her chair. "When can I come?" "Tomorrow," I said. Haley arrived at 9 in the morning, and I took her down to the archive and watched her read. She was a very contained professional, careful and composed, but by the time she had worked through the financial documentation on Vincent and Ronan, a muscle at the corner of her jaw had tightened in a way that I interpreted as controlled outrage. "This is comprehensive," she said. "Daniel was systematic," I agreed. "The financial regulatory implications for Vincent alone are significant." She continued paging through. "Combined with Ronan's involvement in the client documents." She paused. "Mrs. Voss, your husband effectively prepared an entire legal counterstrike. He just left it to you to decide whether to deploy it." I nodded. "What do you want to do?" "I want them to go away and stop," I said. "I don't want to destroy them unless they leave me no other choice. But I want them to understand that the option exists." Haley considered this. "So we used the documentation as leverage in a private settlement negotiation, rather than filing it with any regulatory body." "Exactly. And the mining partnership agreement with Southern Reach." "Ready to sign," I said. "Thomas Alloy has been extraordinarily patient." Haley nodded slowly. "Then I think we invite them to one final meeting, here at Silverbrook, on your terms." I looked at her. "Your husband built an archive," she said, and I heard the respect in her voice. "I think it's time to show them the library." The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday. Haley extended the invitation through Patricia Dunn's office, framing it as a conversation to discuss a potential resolution to the legal dispute. No details, no agenda sent in advance. Zara drove back from Wellington for it. She sat across the dining table from me in a dark blazer, her father's watch on her wrist again. And I thought that if the brothers had any sense at all, they would look at her and understand that whatever they thought they were walking into, it was not what they expected. Kieran moved through the house that morning with quiet efficiency, preparing the room, setting up the projector screen that descended from the ceiling, connecting the laptop to the display. He had been essential to everything, not just the practical maintenance of the property, but the emotional continuity of it, the keeper of Daniel's intentions in the intervals between videos. At 10 o'clock, the black four-wheel drive appeared at the gate. At 10 past 10, Vincent and Ronan sat down at the dining table. Patricia Dunn took her seat. The same unfamiliar financial advisor who had been at the original meeting took the fourth chair. Seth had not been invited by the brothers. I had invited him separately, and he arrived quietly through the side door 10 minutes before the others, which told me he had understood the intention. He sat at the end of the table, which was becoming his characteristic position in this room. Vincent opened with confidence. "We appreciate the opportunity to sit down again, Serena. We believe there's a reasonable path here that doesn't require lengthy litigation for anyone." Their proposal had evolved. It was now presented in writing, a glossy document prepared by Patricia Dunn's office, with figures and property division maps and a narrative framing that made everything sound eminently logical and fair. A 2/3 interest in Silverbrook to the Voss brothers, in exchange for withdrawing the legal challenge and providing a substantial cash payment to me. They emphasized the cash payment. They had clearly decided that cash was what they thought a schoolteacher from the North Island would be most moved by. Daniel had assembled enough here to make their lives extremely complicated. "Why didn't he use this when they came after the property the first time?" Zara asked. Kieran looked at her. Because he didn't want to be like them, he said simply. The archive also contained in the right-hand filing cabinet a set of documents relating to a different matter entirely, a matter I had not anticipated, and which, when I read through it, changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about why Daniel had built this particular safety net so carefully. He had found his mother. Not found her alive. She had passed away 12 years earlier, in a small town in the Waikato, alone and not poor but not wealthy either. But he had found her history. Her name, Margaret Cole. Her life after leaving Silverbrook, a story of quiet survival and considerable resilience. And in that history, he had found something else. A daughter. Margaret's daughter, born 8 years after she had left Silverbrook, a half-sister to Daniel, a woman named Vivian Cole, who was 42 years old and living in Hamilton, entirely unaware that she had any connection to the Voss family, or to Silverbrook Station, or to a brother who had died without ever having the courage to introduce himself. There was a sealed envelope in the back of the file. It was addressed simply, to be opened if necessary. I held it for a moment. Then I set it back in the cabinet. Not yet, I thought. But I understood now why Daniel had gathered it. And I was beginning to understand the architecture of everything he had prepared. It was not just about protecting the property. It was about having answers to questions that hadn't been asked yet. We need to call Mr. Ashford, I told Kieran. And I think we also need to arrange a conversation with a mining company. Not the ones who've been approaching through the brothers, an independent one. There's a company called Southern Reach Resources, Kieran said, based in Dunedin. Mr. Voss was in contact with their CEO in the months before his death. I have the contact details. He left those too? Zara said, a little breathlessly. He thought of everything, Kieran said. Almost. Almost? I looked at him. He didn't predict that his half-brother Seth would turn out to be decent, he said. I think he expected 3 adversaries. He only got 2. I thought of Seth on the veranda steps, staring at the hills. Seth's voice at the end of the dining room table saying, "She's right." Seth's eyes meeting mine briefly, before he dropped them. Not yet, I thought again, but Seth was something to think about. That evening I called Zara's video with her on the couch beside me, so she could hear. This time, it was Daniel in a different setting, outdoors on the eastern veranda, the hills behind him in afternoon light. The brothers will eventually escalate beyond legal arguments, he said. If they do, I want you to make one phone call before you make any others. He gave a name and a number, both of which Kieran confirmed were current. The name was Thomas Alloy, CEO of Southern Reach Resources. Daniel had apparently spent 6 months in careful conversation with Thomas, laying out a vision for what responsible extraction at Silverbrook could look like. Not a sale of the mineral rights, not a carve-up of the land, a partnership arrangement with detailed environmental protections, restoration commitments built into the contract, and a structure that kept Serena and Zara in full ownership while providing a royalty income for multiple generations. He'd already done the negotiation, Zara said quietly. He'd spent 6 months laying the groundwork with the best option available, so you wouldn't have to do it under pressure. I couldn't speak for a moment. The reason this matters, Daniel continued on the video, is that the brothers will almost certainly approach you with their own mining contact. Someone who will present numbers that seem generous, but who will be structured to benefit their involvement as middlemen. If you've already spoken with Thomas, you'll know what the real value looks like, and you'll understand why their offer is designed to confuse, rather than inform. He looked directly at the camera. You're smarter than they're counting on you being, love. That's always been the thing they'll never understand about you. You look like the soft option, and you are not the soft option. If you're still with me in this story, still listening and feeling every turn of it, then please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments which city or town you're from, because I want to build a community of women and people who believe that a voice telling the truth matters. Help me keep bringing stories like this one to you. We're getting to the part where everything comes together. The following week was the most deliberately active I had been in my entire adult life outside of a classroom. I called Thomas Alloy and had a 2-hour conversation that felt less like a business negotiation and more like two people who had both been briefed by the same very thorough third party. He knew Daniel's environmental conditions by heart. He had already had 3 geological assessments done in anticipation of exactly this conversation. He quoted numbers that made me hold the phone away from my face for a second to breathe. I called Haley Fraser every morning and asked for updates on the brothers' legal proceedings. I sat with Zara every evening and watched 2 or 3 of Daniel's videos, building a picture of a man neither of us had fully known while he was alive, not because he was deceptive, but because grief and time and the inevitable narrowing of daily life had left so many conversations unheld. And every morning I sat at the piano for an hour before the rest of the day began. The music was coming back. My hands remembered things my mind had stopped believing it knew. On the 8th day at Silverbrook, the brothers made their move. Patricia Dunn filed a formal legal challenge with the High Court, challenging the validity of the original sale from Gordon Voss to Daniel, citing a recently obtained document that they claimed was a second, later will from Gordon Voss, which explicitly left Silverbrook Station to his eldest 3 sons. It arrived by email to Haley's office at 9 in the morning. By 9:15, she called me. "This document is dated 6 months before Gordon Voss died," she said. "Daniel's purchase was completed 2 years before that date. The document references Silverbrook explicitly, but, and this is important, it was drawn up after the property had already been legally transferred. It has no legal effect on the ownership." "Then why file it?" I asked. "To delay," she said. "To create public uncertainty. And possibly to create enough noise that a less prepared landowner might consider a settlement simply to make it stop." I thought of the archive beneath the woolshed. "Haley," I said, "I think it's time to have a full conversation about the documentation my husband left. There's more than I showed you in the initial meeting." I heard her sit forward in her chair. "When can I come?" "Tomorrow," I said. Haley arrived at 9 in the morning, and I took her down to the archive and watched her read. She was a very contained professional, careful and composed, but by the time she had worked through the financial documentation on Vincent and Ronan, a muscle at the corner of her jaw had tightened in a way that I interpreted as controlled outrage. "This is comprehensive," she said. "Daniel was systematic," I agreed. "The financial regulatory implications for Vincent alone are significant." She continued paging through. "Combined with Ronan's involvement in the client documents." She paused. "Mrs. Voss, your husband effectively prepared an entire legal counterstrike. He just left it to you to decide whether to deploy it." I nodded. "What do you want to do?" "I want them to go away and stop," I said. "I don't want to destroy them unless they leave me no other choice. But I want them to understand that the option exists." Haley considered this. "So we used the documentation as leverage in a private settlement negotiation, rather than filing it with any regulatory body." "Exactly. And the mining partnership agreement with Southern Reach." "Ready to sign," I said. "Thomas Alloy has been extraordinarily patient." Haley nodded slowly. "Then I think we invite them to one final meeting, here at Silverbrook, on your terms." I looked at her. "Your husband built an archive," she said, and I heard the respect in her voice. "I think it's time to show them the library." The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday. Haley extended the invitation through Patricia Dunn's office, framing it as a conversation to discuss a potential resolution to the legal dispute. No details, no agenda sent in advance. Zara drove back from Wellington for it. She sat across the dining table from me in a dark blazer, her father's watch on her wrist again. And I thought that if the brothers had any sense at all, they would look at her and understand that whatever they thought they were walking into, it was not what they expected. Kieran moved through the house that morning with quiet efficiency, preparing the room, setting up the projector screen that descended from the ceiling, connecting the laptop to the display. He had been essential to everything, not just the practical maintenance of the property, but the emotional continuity of it, the keeper of Daniel's intentions in the intervals between videos. At 10 o'clock, the black four-wheel drive appeared at the gate. At 10 past 10, Vincent and Ronan sat down at the dining table. Patricia Dunn took her seat. The same unfamiliar financial advisor and had been at the original meeting, took the fourth chair. Seth had not been invited by the brothers. I had invited him separately, and he arrived quietly through the side door 10 minutes before the others, which told me he had understood the intention. He sat at the end of the table, which was becoming his characteristic position in this room. Vincent opened with confidence. "We appreciate the opportunity to sit down again, Serena. We believe there's a reasonable path here that doesn't require lengthy litigation for anyone." Their proposal had evolved. It was now presented in writing, a glossy document prepared by Patricia Dunn's office, with figures and property division maps and a narrative framing that made everything sound eminently logical and fair. A 2/3 interest in Silverbrook to the Voss brothers, in exchange for withdrawing the legal challenge and providing a substantial cash payment to me. They emphasized the cash payment. They had clearly decided that cash was what they thought a schoolteacher from the North Island would be most moved by. I waited until Patricia Dunn had finished her explanatory notes. Then I nodded to Kieran, and the projector came on. The first image that appeared on the screen was the complete geological survey of Silverbrook, including the western section. I watched the moment register on their faces with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been patient for a long time. The second image was a signed letter of intent from Southern Reach Resources, committing to a partnership arrangement with Silverbrook Station under the terms I had negotiated with Thomas Alloy. The royalty numbers were visible. Patricia Dunn's expression shifted. She was good, I'll give her that. She absorbed the numbers and recalibrated without pause. Vincent was not quite as fast. I watched the mathematics move across his face. "We're aware of the geological surveys," Vincent said carefully. "The complete surveys?" I asked, "including the primary formation in the western section?" A pause. "The formation everyone's aware of is in the eastern section." I nodded pleasantly. "Your proposal excludes the western section. I assumed that was a deliberate decision on your part, given that the primary formation is located there." Something moved in Ronan's expression, something complicated and not entirely pleasant to watch. The third image that appeared on the screen was not a map or a financial document. It was the front page of the documentation from the archive, clearly labeled, clearly organized. "I don't know if any of you are familiar with the New Zealand Financial Markets Authority's reporting requirements for investment fund managers," I said. "I've been doing some reading. Haley has been an excellent guide." Vincent went still. "I won't pretend I enjoy this," I said, keeping my voice even. "Your brother didn't either. He assembled this record not to use it, but to have it, as a safeguard. He hoped it would never be necessary." His exact words, in a video recorded a year ago, were that he expected the most favorable outcome was for this documentation to remain permanently in a cabinet and never see daylight. The room was very quiet, but he also said, I continued, that I should use my own judgment about when it had become necessary. Vincent looked at me for a long moment. The businessman's composure was still in place, but something beneath it had shifted. "I want them to be afraid," Daniel had said in one of the videos. "Not of you, not of me. Afraid of themselves, afraid of what they've already done catching up with them. That's the only fear that makes people like my brothers reasonable." "What exactly do you want?" Vincent asked. "I want the legal challenge withdrawn. I want written confirmation that neither you, nor Ronan, nor anyone acting on your behalf will make any further attempt to contest my ownership of Silverbrook Station or to approach my daughter with any proposals, legal or otherwise, relating to this property. And I want that confirmation notarized and filed. And in exchange? In exchange, this material remains where it is. Private." Ronan leaned forward. "That's extortion." "No," said Haley from beside me, with a precision that I found deeply satisfying. "Extortion involves demanding something you aren't entitled to. Mrs. Voss is simply making clear that if your legal challenge continues, she will have no choice but to pursue all available defenses, including raising questions about the credibility of the parties making the challenge. That's not extortion. That's disclosure." Patricia Dunn's pen had stopped moving some minutes earlier. Seth spoke from the end of the table. "Sign it," he said quietly. "Both of you, sign it and leave this woman in peace. Ronan turned on him. You don't get a vote in this. I was never against her, Seth said. I was only here because you told me it was about fairness. I'm sorry for my part in it. I looked at him for a moment. You can stay, if you want, after this meeting, I said. I'd like to tell you some things about your brother. His jaw tightened briefly, and then released. He nodded once. The documents were signed 40 minutes later. Patricia Dunn's professionalism held to the last, and I credited her for that, even though she had been working against me throughout. Vincent signed without meeting my eyes. Ronan signed with the contained fury of a man who knows he has no remaining argument. As they stood to leave, Vincent paused at the door. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the projector screen, which still showed the geological map with its blue property lines and its red deposit markers. Did he know what he had when he bought it back? He asked. No, I said. When he bought it, he didn't know about the lithium. He bought it because he was dying, and he wanted to leave me something that mattered. Vincent absorbed this. When he left, his shoulders were different. After they had gone, after Kieran had cleared the dining room, and Haley had departed with the signed documents, and Peter had taken Zara out to the paddock to learn something about the horses that Zara would probably claim to know more about within the week, I sat alone in the dining room with the projector still on, and the map of Silverbrook still glowing on the screen. Seth knocked on the open door. May I? He asked. Please, I said. He sat down across from me, not in the adversarial position of earlier, but simply the posture of someone who is tired and wants to rest. He told me about you once, Seth said. When I was about 20, he came back to Silverbrook for one day, just one, to see if our father would admit to what he and the others had done. Father didn't. Daniel left again that afternoon, but he stayed long enough to talk to me. He said he'd met the woman he was going to marry. He said she was teaching him to listen to music properly, and it was changing everything about him. I looked at my hands on the table. He talked about her for an hour, Seth said. He seemed so certain. Not arrogant, just certain. The way people are when they found the right thing, and they know it. That sounds like him, I said. He paused. Did he know about our mother? That she was alive for longer than anyone said? I nodded. He found out not long before he died. Did he try to find her? He found her history, I said. He found out that she had passed away some years before. But he also found that she had a daughter, a half-sister to both of you. Seth stared at me. Her name is Vivian, I said. She's in Hamilton. She doesn't know any of this. Daniel left an envelope in the archive with her contact information and a letter explaining everything. He never sent it himself. He left the decision to me. Seth was very quiet for a long moment. Are you going to send it? I don't know yet, I said honestly. I think that decision might partly belong to you. You're her half-brother too. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between disbelief and the particular softness that comes when someone has spent a long time being surprised by nothing, and then something surprises them. You're including me, he said. Your brother would have wanted that, I said. He nodded slowly, and I let the silence hold, and outside the window, the afternoon light was moving across the Silverbrook hills in the long, warm way it did in the late afternoon, turning the tawny grass golden, making the schist walls of the old woolshed glow briefly like something from a century ago. It was the most peaceful I had felt since the hospital corridor. Autumn moved into winter at Silverbrook with the gradual drama of high country seasons, the beeches turning and dropping, morning frost appearing on the paddock rails, the creek running fuller with the cold. I had been living at Silverbrook for 2 months by the time the mining partnership agreement with Southern Reach was formally signed, and during those 2 months, the farm had become something I could only describe as the place I was supposed to be. My old life in Auckland, my school, my curriculum planning, my orderly flat with its neat bookshelf and its adequate kitchen felt not distant exactly, but smaller. Not smaller in a dismissive way, smaller in the way a shell becomes small when what was inside it has grown. Zara drove up every second weekend. She had taken on some remote work that allowed her to be at Silverbrook more than the weekends eventually, and I watched her relationship with the horses and the property develop in the particular way of someone who has found a place their body already knows. She sat at the piano sometimes, not with any great skill, but with a willingness that made the sound of it right. Seth came twice, once alone, walking the property with Kieran for most of the day, saying little but taking everything in. Once with a question about Vivian Cole that I had been expecting. "I'd thought about it," he said. I keep coming back to the same thing, which is, if Daniel knew about her for 2 years and didn't contact her himself, it wasn't because he didn't want to. It was because he was protecting her from all of us, from the mess of what the Voss family is. He spread his hands on the kitchen table. Maybe the kindest thing we can do is leave her alone. I looked at him for a long time. Or, I said, maybe that decision isn't ours to make for her. Maybe she deserves to know where she came from and decide for herself what she wants to do about it. He sat with that. He was still sitting with it 2 weeks later when the unexpected call came. I was in the music room, working through a Schubert sonata that was going reasonably well in some sections and badly in others, when my phone rang. An unknown number with a Hamilton area code. I answered it out of habit. "Is this Serena Voss?" a woman's voice said. She had a particular quality to her voice, clear and measured, with a slight formality, that spoke of someone who had chosen their words carefully their whole life. "Yes," I said. "My name is Vivian Cole. I think I might be related to your husband." The silence that followed lasted about 3 seconds. Then I said, "Please tell me how you found me." As it turned out, Vivian had found her own way. A genealogy website search. Daniel's death notice, which had been published in the New Zealand Herald, had included a reference to his original family connections in the Otago region. Vivian had been quietly researching her father for years, knowing only that he had been a South Island farmer and that he had died before she was old enough to know him. She had traced a branch of the family tree forward through public records and found Daniel's name, and then Daniel's death, and then my name as his surviving spouse. She had already been crying when she called, though she was containing it with the same careful restraint I recognized from Daniel's own manner of managing emotion. I sat down on the piano stool and told her. I told her everything I knew, which was everything Daniel's videos and archive had told me. I told her about her mother, Margaret Cole, and the years she had spent quietly surviving after leaving Silverbrook. I told her about Daniel, who had grown up without either of his parents in any real sense, and had grown anyway into someone extraordinary. I told her about the archive in the woolshed, and the sealed envelope with her name on the contact information. I told her that I believed her half-brother Seth would like to meet her if she was willing. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "He never came to find me," she said finally. "Daniel." "No," I said gently. "I think he was afraid of what he might bring into your life along with himself. His family has not been particularly kind to people. He worried about importing that. He sounds like he was the same as my mother," she said, "always protecting everyone else at his own expense." I felt the truth of that land heavily. "Yes," I said, "exactly like that." Vivian came to Silverbrook in July, a month after the call, driving down from Hamilton on a clear winter morning that put ice on the paddock rails and turned the creek to glass. She was 42 years old, small and dark-haired, with nothing overtly of Daniel in her features until she looked at the hills, and I saw the exact quality of stillness that Daniel had always had when he was taking something in. Seth came the same weekend. Neither of them knew the other would be there until they arrived, which I am still not entirely sorry about. Sometimes people need a fact rather than a plan. They sat across the kitchen table from each other in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but simply very full. Then Seth said, "You look like him." And Vivian said, "Do I?" And that was the beginning. I left them in the kitchen and went to the music room and played for 2 hours, and when I came out, they were still at the table, and Kieran had made lunch, and Sarah, who had arrived during the piano session, was sitting at the end of the table, listening to Vivian talk about Margaret Cole, and writing things down in her notebook, with the focused attention of someone who is keeping family history properly. 4 months into my life at Silverbrook, the partnership agreement with Southern Reach Resources had been finalized and construction had begun on the access roads to the western section. Thomas Alloy had been throughout exactly the kind of professional Daniel had predicted, patient, committed to the environmental terms, and genuinely interested in the project, rather than merely the financial outcome. The royalty income, when it began arriving, was substantial enough to change the shape of the next generation at Silverbrook in ways I was only beginning to imagine. But that wasn't the part that kept me awake at night, with something that felt like anticipation rather than insomnia. The part that kept me in that state was something that happened in the music room on a Thursday evening in August, 6 months after I had first sat down at the Steinway. I had been working on a piece I had started composing myself, not consciously at first, just playing variations on a theme that kept returning to my hands when I wasn't thinking hard enough to stop it. It was something between a lullaby and a hymn, rooted in the particular sound of the Schubert sonata, but growing into something that wasn't Schubert at all. The creek sound and the beach in wind, and the quality of morning light over the eastern ridge, and the way comets' hooves sounded on the dry summer grass. I played it through from beginning to end for the first time and sat for a moment in the quiet after the last note faded. Then I reached over and pressed record on the audio equipment Daniel had set up in the corner, and played it again. I listened back to it that evening, sitting on the piano bench with my knees drawn up and a cup of tea going cold on the lid of the instrument. And I thought about what Daniel had said in one of the later videos, week 3, day 19. He had been sitting outdoors on the veranda when he filmed it, late afternoon, a book closed on the table beside him. "The farm is not the inheritance, love," he had said. "I've said that before. But I want to say it differently today. The inheritance is permission. Permission to take up all the space you have always been entitled to take up, and never quite did. Permission to be as good at the things you love as you actually are. Permission to make something new out of the materials of a life that had reasons to be quiet." He paused, looking at the hills. I wish I'd have been braver about saying this while I was there to say it in person. I wish I had found a way to tell you, on an ordinary Tuesday, how extraordinary I found you. He looked back at the camera. Consider this Tuesday. I had watched that video 4 times. I played the recording back one more time, and decided, sitting in that winter-lit room with the dark outside the tall windows, that I was going to do something with it. Not for acclaim or audience, or any of the professional reasons a musician might cite. Because it was the truest thing I had made in 20 years, and making true things Daniel had shown me was the only response to a life that insists on being larger than you planned. The following morning, I did 3 things before breakfast. I fed Comet a carrot from the kitchen garden, which Kieran grew with an attention to detail that would have surprised anyone who didn't know him. I sat at the piano and played through the composition twice more, refining the ending, which had been slightly unresolved in the same way that endings often are when you're not yet sure whether the story is finished or simply paused. And I opened Daniel's laptop and watched day 247, which was labeled in the careful naming convention he had used throughout, for when Serena finishes the first piece. He appeared on screen in the music room. This room, before the piano had been installed, before most of the fittings. He was sitting on a folding chair in the middle of the empty space, holding a cup of coffee, and the windows behind him showed the hills in early morning light. "Hello, love," he said. "I'm going to make an assumption here, which is that if this video is labeled correctly, you have written something of yours, not a student's essay, or a school curriculum, or a song you learned to teach from a book, but something that came out of you." He smiled, "And I want you to know that wherever I am, I'm listening. I'm always listening." He paused. "I want to tell you something about why I came back to Silverbrook. Not the practical reason, not the inheritance, not the protection I wanted to build for you. The real reason. When you're told you have 2 to 5 years, you spend a great deal of time working out what you actually believe. What you believe about time, about love, about whether anything you've done matters." He looked up. "What I kept coming back to was this. Every beautiful thing I ever cared about in my life, I had found through you. Every piece of music I actually heard, rather than simply listened to. Every book that changed something in me. Every horse I stood next to long enough to understand." All of it was refracted through your attention. You taught me to pay attention, and this place," he gestured at the bare room around him, "is my attempt to give that back, to give you a space where your attention can go as far and as deep as it has always deserved." He raised his coffee cup slightly. "Make things, Serena. Make all the things. The world needs more of them, and so do I, wherever I am." He paused. "I mean that seriously. If there's any mechanism by which the dead can hear music, I'm entirely counting on you to find it." I was laughing again. I was always laughing and crying at these videos, sometimes simultaneously, in a way that would have looked alarming to anyone who didn't understand. I closed the laptop and sat in the music room for a while, and then I opened it again and went back to the folder. I had watched by that point roughly 215 of the 365 videos. The remaining 150 was still ahead of me, waiting, and I had developed over the months a kind of careful relationship with them. Not rationing them exactly, but not burning through them either. They were conversations, and like the best conversations, they were worth not rushing. But there was one more video I hadn't yet found the courage to watch. It was in a separate folder, not dated, not numbered, simply labeled Last. I had known it was there since the first week. I had been putting it off, with the particular logic of someone who knows that finishing a thing means it is finished. On the evening of the day I heard Vivian and Seth talking in the kitchen for the first time. On the evening after I had played the composition through from start to finish, I sat down in the study at Daniel's desk, under the lamp he had chosen, surrounded by the books he had selected, with the dried coreopsis still pressed under its piece of glass on the desk, and I clicked the last folder open and pressed play. The eastern ridge behind him, and the light was the particular quality of a late summer evening in the Otago Hills, rich and almost amber. He was sitting on the old schist wall that ran along the upper paddock, and he looked healthy, and he looked peaceful, and he looked like himself, the deepest version of himself. Not love, not cat. Serena, my whole name, the way he used it when he was being the most serious. "If you're watching this, it means you've made it through the year." He smiled. "Or you couldn't wait. Both are fine." He looked at the hills behind him for a moment. "I've been trying to work out what to say in this video for a long time. Everything I thought of seemed either too much or not enough." He looked back at the camera. "I think what I want to say is simply this. I have loved you since the evening we met, when you were standing in a garden holding a yellow flower and arguing with great confidence about a poet you had definitely read more carefully than the person you were arguing with. I have loved you on every ordinary day since then, including the days when ordinary was complicated, and the days when we were both too tired for beauty. I have loved you while building this place that I hope has become something more than what it was." He paused. "But here is what I want you to understand. This year I've walked with you through grief and through battle, and through discovery, and through beginning. Because I knew you well enough to plan for all of it, and because loving you has always required paying close attention. But from here, love, you walk forward without me. Not because I'm leaving you, but because you have everything you need." He smiled, and it was the truest smile I had ever seen on his face. "The farm is yours. The music is yours. The horses are yours. The life ahead of you is entirely and wonderfully yours to build." He raised one hand slightly, a small gesture, the kind of gesture that substitutes for everything that words can't carry. "I'll be in the music when you play it," he said. "That's where you'll find me." He reached forward and stopped the recording. I sat in the study for a long time. Then I went to the music room and sat at the Steinway, and I played the composition, all the way through, beginning to end, with the recording running, and the winter dark outside, and Silverbrook settling around me in the particular way it did each evening. All its sounds and its silences, the creek and the beach and the horses in the paddocks, and the old schist walls holding the cold. When I finished, I sat in the quiet for a moment. And then I played it again. In the months that followed, Silverbrook became something I had not originally had the imagination to envision. Not simply a home or an inheritance, though it was both of those things. It became a working entity with purpose and structure, and the kind of forward momentum that comes when a place is loved into vitality, rather than simply maintained. The partnership with Southern Reach progressed with the careful pace that responsible extraction requires. And Thomas Alloy visited quarterly, walking the land with Kieran and the environmental oversight team that he had hired on the terms I insisted on. A team that included a representative from the local iwi whose connection to this land predated every Voss by centuries, and whose knowledge of the waterways and hillsides was worth more than every geological survey combined. The music room became a real studio across a summer of gradual additions, a small recording area in the adjacent room, properly treated, which I had helped design with the advice of a sound engineer, who drove up from Christchurch twice and pronounced the existing acoustic quality of the north-facing room already exceptional. I had composed 3 pieces by autumn, not polished productions, not professional recordings, but things that were real, that had come from the specific experience of being in this land, and in this grief, and in this discovery, and that I played for people when they asked, which was surprisingly often. Vivian brought her daughter to Silverbrook in November. Her daughter was 12, brightly curious in a way that reminded me painfully of Zara at the same age, and she asked to meet the horses within about 11 minutes of arriving, which Peter accommodated with visible delight. Vivienne sat on the veranda with me in the autumn light and talked about her mother for the first time with someone who had reason to listen carefully. And I told her about the file in the archive, Margaret's history as Daniel had traced it, and she cried in the contained and careful way of someone who has had a long time to practice containing things. Seth visited regularly, often quietly, sometimes just for a few hours. He had a particular relationship with Comet that I found funny in the way that horse people always find slightly funny the relationships between non-horse people and horses. The complete capitulation of the human, while the horse remains entirely self-possessed. He was building something with Vivienne, slowly, a sibling relationship, assembled from the materials of shared history and shared loss, rather than shared experience. It required patience. They both had enough of it. On a February morning, almost a year after the day I had first sat in Mr. Ashford's office and turned an iron key in my palm, I took Comet out for a long ride along the upper track that ran through the Silver Beach and across the ridge overlooking the valley. It was early morning, the light still low and long, the frost just beginning to lift from the high grass. From the ridge, I could see Silverbrook Station spread out below me, the homestead with its schist walls, and the smoke just beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney. The paddocks where dust and rafter moved in their morning circuits, the woolshed and its invisible archive, the access road winding toward the western hills where Southern Reach's equipment worked in careful accordance with everything we had required of them. Kieran's cottage near the stables, lights on, him already at work. Zara's hire car in the yard, which meant she had arrived late last night, which meant there was coffee made, and she was probably in the library, reading something she'd claimed not to have been affected by. I sat on Comet on the ridge and looked at all of it for a long time. This is what Daniel had seen in his mind when he stood in a ruined, neglected station property 3 years ago and decided to spend his remaining time transforming it. Not the property as it had been, not the site of his difficult childhood, but the property as it could become. A place of genuine beauty and genuine purpose, held by people who understood what it cost to build something worth keeping. He had been right that it would require a fight. He had been right about the brothers, about their tactics, about what they would try. He had been right about Zara's initial vulnerability and her ultimate loyalty. He had been right in one of his most quietly startling moments of foresight, about the composition, about the studio, about the fact that the music was still there, that it had simply been waiting. What he had not fully anticipated, and what I suspected he would have found deeply satisfying, was Vivian, the half-sister who had found her own way to the door before I needed to open it for her, the piece of family history that had arrived on its own terms rather than anyone else's. I reached down and patted Comet's neck, and he flicked an ear back at me in the way he did when he was allowing me to be sentimental. I thought about Daniel's last video, the amber light on the schist wall, his quiet voice saying, "This is where you walk forward without me." I had been walking forward without him since the hospital corridor, and I would be walking forward without him for the rest of my life. And that was the truest thing about grief, the thing no one says directly, but everyone who has felt it knows. The walking forward is not the same as the leaving behind. You carry the person with you as you go. They become part of the direction you walk, rather than the place you return to. He was in the composition. He was in Comet's particular choice of me as the person to press his forehead against. He was in the library room, full of books he had sourced one by one over 3 years. He was in every decision I made at Silverbrook that was shaped by what he had taught me about paying attention. He had been a structural engineer by profession, and he had built structures that lasted, bridges and buildings and foundations designed to carry weight across time. And then, knowing his time was limited, he had built one last structure, the largest and most complex of all. Not in steel and concrete, but in care and foresight and love. Silverbrook Station. And me. He had built me, or built me better, or given me back to myself. However you say it, the meaning is the same. I had arrived at this place a grieving widow who thought she knew her husband, and had walked inside to find a life she had not known she was living toward. I turned Comet back toward the homestead, and let him pick his pace down the track through the beach, and below me, Silverbrook moved in its morning rhythms, and the creek said its usual thing to the stones, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney said someone was making breakfast, and all of it was real and present and entirely undeniably mine. If you have stayed with this story from beginning to end, if Serena's voice and Daniel's love and this place called Silverbrook have mattered to you at all, then I want you to do something for me right now. Like this video and subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments which city or town you are from, because I want to see how far a woman's voice can travel when she tells the truth about love and loss and what it means to rebuild. Help me build this community so we can keep bringing stories like this one to you. Stories about women who discover that the life they thought they were living was only ever the beginning of the one they were meant to build. I just mounted at the stable yard, and Peter took Comet's lead rope with the cheerful competence of someone born to horses, and I walked across the yard toward the homestead and the coffee and Zara in the library. I stopped at the front step and turned back for a moment, looking at the hills. "Thank you, Daniel," I said quietly, "for all of it." The hills held the cold light. The creek ran. The beaches stood in their silver and gold, and Silverbrook Station answered back in the only language a place can speak, which is the language of its continuing existence, its persistence in the morning, its refusal to be anything other than entirely, stubbornly, beautifully here. I went inside, the door closed behind me, and the story, which had begun with a promise I had kept for 22 years and ended with a life I was only beginning to understand, continued in the way that the best stories always do, not with a conclusion, but with the next chapter.